The lobby of Meridian Tower was always moving a current of pressed suits, clipped conversations, and the relentless percussion of leather shoes on polished marble. Security badges beeped in rhythmic succession. Elevators opened and swallowed whole crowds. Coffee cups changed hands at the espresso kiosk near the south entrance, without anyone looking at who was selling them. The screens on the east wall cycled through stock tickers and weather data and the quarterly numbers that meant everything to some people and nothing at all to others. The building breathed ambition the way other places breathed air, and every person inside it had somewhere urgent to be, something important to prove, something valuable to protect. Nobody looked at the maintenance worker pushing his cart toward the east corridor. Nobody ever did. He was part of the building, the same way the light fixtures and ventilation grates were necessary, invisible, unremarkable. The kind of person a city produces in enormous numbers and forgets in the same proportion. That morning, Elena Carter had already been in 3 meetings before 9. By the time she stepped out of the 42nd floor conference room, she was carrying the weight of $147 million in projected quarterly losses, 2 board members who had stopped trusting her, a press cycle that had decided to be unkind this week, and a migraine that had been building behind her left eye since 4 in the morning. Her calendar, which Marcus managed with the devotional intensity of someone responsible for the movements of a small government, had no white space in it until 7 in the evening. She had eaten a protein bar at 5:30. She had not, in 3 weeks, sat down for a meal without her phone face up on the table. Her apartment, when she arrived home each night after 10, was exactly as she had left it, immaculate, temperature-controlled, silent in the particular way of spaces that have never developed a personality because no one has spent enough time inside them to give them one. Her assistant, Marcus, followed half a step behind her now, reading from a tablet 3 interviews, 1 press briefing, a call with the Singapore office at 6, and a dinner with the infrastructure team that she had been rescheduling for 3 weeks and could not reschedule again. Elena barely heard him. She reached into the paper bag she'd grabbed from the lobby cafe before the first meeting, pulled out a turkey and avocado sandwich she had never once tasted warmly, and took a bite as she walked. She walked fast. She always walked fast. Standing still, in her experience, was how you ended up buried. The next 10 seconds would not care about her schedule. She felt it first as a tightness, a stubborn pressure in her throat. Not painful, just wrong. She slowed her step and tried to swallow against it. It didn't move. She tried again, and this time her airway sealed shut with a certainty that sent cold electricity straight down her spine. Her hands flew to her neck. Her eyes went wide. Marcus turned at the sound. She made not quite a word, not quite a cough, more like the ghost of a sound, and his face went pale in an instant. Around her, the hallway foot traffic continued for 1 full breath before someone noticed, and then the ripples spread outward, fast and ugly. A woman clutched a colleague's arm. A man in a gray suit backed up against the wall with his phone already raised. Someone shouted for security from somewhere around the corner. Elena Carter, CEO of Meridian Technologies, was on her knees on the 42nd floor, and not a single person in that hallway knew what to do. Daniel Brooks was 30 feet away, crouched beside an HVAC access panel, when he heard it. Not the shouting. The shouting came after. He heard the silence inside the shouting. The particular held breath quality of a crowd, watching something they do not understand and cannot stop. He had heard that silence once before, in a hospital waiting room 5 years ago, and he had understood then, with a clarity that time had not blunted, that silence was the sound of a situation running out of options. He had promised himself then that if he ever heard it again, he would not stand still. He had kept that promise every day since, in the small, undramatic ways that promises mostly get kept, by taking the first aid recertification course, by reading the refresher materials, by thinking, occasionally, in the back of his mind, about whether he would know what to do. Now, he dropped his wrench. He stood. He moved. She was on the floor by the time he reached her, braced on one hand, the other still at her throat. Her face cycling from red to something darker and more frightening. The crowd parted for him not because they recognized his authority, but because he was moving with a purpose that none of them had, and purpose, in a moment of collective paralysis, is its own kind of permission. He knelt behind her. He put one hand flat against her sternum, and the other into a fist, just below her rib cage. He leaned close to her ear and said, quietly, "I've got you. Stay with me." She was shaking. He could feel it. He performed the thrust controlled, firm, deliberate, and nothing happened. The crowd made a sound. He did it again. The piece of food came free on the third compression, and Elena Carter collapsed forward, catching herself on both hands, gasping in long, desperate pulls of air that sounded almost like crying because they were. The hallway was absolutely silent. Daniel stayed beside her, one hand steady on her shoulder. And when she had pulled in enough air to lift her head, he looked at her, not at the crowd, not at the phones still raised and recording, not at the security team now jogging around the corner, and he asked, simply, "Can you breathe?" She nodded. She was crying and breathing and nodding all at once, and Daniel sat back on his heels and exhaled slowly, the way a person exhales when they have been holding something very heavy and can finally set it down. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then everyone said everything at once. Elena Carter had not cried in front of another person in 11 years. She knew this precisely because the last time had been at her mother's memorial service, when she was 24, and still learning how to transform grief into productivity, vulnerability into strategy. She had been very successful at the transformation. By 30, she was running a division. By 33, she was the youngest CEO in Meridian's history. By 35, she owned a penthouse on the 48th floor of a building in the financial district, where the furniture was expensive and the rooms were enormous, and the windows looked out over a city that never stopped, performing its busyness, and she felt, most nights, exactly as hollow as the wind sounded against the glass. She did not think about hollowness very often. She was too busy. Busyness, she had learned, was an excellent substitute for most things a person might otherwise need. The company physician cleared her within the hour, soft tissue irritation, mild trauma response, no lasting damage. Elena sat on the exam table in the small medical room on the 38th floor and looked at her hands. They were still trembling, very slightly, in the way a tuning fork trembles after it has been struck. She had nearly died in a hallway. She had nearly died because she was eating a sandwich while walking because she had not allowed herself 20 minutes to sit down and eat lunch like a person who expected to live long enough to finish it. She thought about this. She thought about all the lunches and dinners and slow Saturday mornings she had traded in over 14 years for the thing she was building. And she tried to name the thing she was building, and the name came slowly and with more difficulty than she expected. She thought about the man who had found her on the floor and stayed calm when everyone else had failed completely to be calm. And she thought about the way he had said, "Stay with me," as though it were the simplest, most available thing in the world, as though staying were something a person could just choose, just offer. Just give for free to a stranger on a floor. Marcus knocked and entered with a look she recognized, the look that meant he was carrying two competing thoughts and hadn't yet decided which to lead with. He led with the practical one. "We've arranged for the appropriate documentation, given the circumstances," and he paused, then handed her a folded check. The board suggested a gesture, a significant one, $100,000. Elena looked at the number and felt, for the first time in a long time, that money was a slightly absurd thing. Daniel was back on the east corridor by the time Marcus found him, pushing his cart around the corner near the service elevator, earbuds in, humming something low and tuneless. He stopped when Marcus touched his arm. He pulled out one earbud and listened to the offer with the same expression he might wear if someone told him it was going to rain tomorrow, interested. Noting it, not particularly troubled by it either way. Then he looked at the check for a moment and handed it back. "That's generous," he said. "But no." "Thank you." Marcus blinked. "Sir, it's a substantial. I know what it is." Daniel's voice was not unfriendly. It was, in fact, remarkably gentle, which made it somehow harder to argue with. "My daughter's 8 years old. If she ever finds out I took money for helping someone who needed help." He paused, put his earbud back in, and looked at Marcus with something that was not quite pity, but was adjacent to it. "She'd be ashamed of me, and she's the only person whose opinion I actually lose sleep over." He went back to pushing his cart. Marcus stood in the hallway for a full 30 seconds before he remembered how to walk. Elena heard the report that evening. Sitting at the granite island in her penthouse kitchen with a glass of water she wasn't drinking, and the city glittering below her like a circuit board that had forgotten what it was computing. Marcus delivered the account word for word, because she had asked him to, and she listened without interrupting, which was unusual. When he finished, she said nothing. He left. She sat there for a long time, in the particular silence of a large apartment where someone lives alone and has come to understand that silence as a default condition rather than an interruption. She thought about what Daniel had said. She turned it over the way you turn over a stone you weren't expecting, the kind that surprises you by being heavier than it looks. She'd be ashamed of me. Not I don't need the money. Not I'm just doing what anyone would do. Not the performed modesty of a man who secretly wants to be thanked more elaborately. He meant it. He genuinely, straightforwardly meant it that taking a check for a human act would compromise something essential, not in himself exactly, but in the story his daughter was learning to tell about how the world worked. He was protecting her understanding of things. Elena tried to remember if anyone had ever done that for her. Her mother had died of a cardiac episode when Elena was 21, in a hospital in Phoenix, where the billing department had called 3 times in the 48 hours following her admission to discuss the insurance gap. Elena had been a junior in college, working 2 part-time jobs, and the calls had landed on her because her father had already stopped answering. She had stood in a hospital corridor not unlike the one she had nearly died in herself, speaking to a billing representative about co-pays, while her mother was in a room down the hall trying to survive. Her mother had not survived. Elena had taken out a loan, paid the outstanding balance over 4 years, and decided with the cold, clarifying logic of someone who has been failed by softness that money was the only thing that stood reliably between a person and the worst things that could happen to them. She had spent the next 14 years making herself very, very good at acquiring it. And then, a maintenance worker had handed back $100,000 to protect his daughter's moral imagination. And something in Elena's carefully constructed architecture had developed a crack. She opened her laptop. She typed his name into the internal employee system. Daniel Brooks, maintenance technician, 12 years with the company. Hired originally through a third-party contracting firm. Converted to full-time 6 years ago. Performance reviews, consistently excellent. Commendations, 2, both from floor managers, both citing exceptional reliability and interpersonal care. Emergency contact. Lily Brooks, daughter, age 8. Medical notes in the HR file, dependent enrolled in company health plan. History of moderate to severe asthma, ongoing specialist care. Elena read this last line twice. She closed the laptop. She sat with the dark, quiet knowledge that this man was working double shifts in a building he did not own to pay for the health care of a child who called him the most important thing in her world, and he had turned down $100,000 because he did not want her to learn the wrong lesson about love. The next morning, Elena cleared an hour from her calendar, an act that required Marcus to reschedule 2 calls and cancel a breakfast meeting, and that prompted him to ask, with the delicate concern of someone diffusing a situation, whether she was feeling unwell. "I'm fine," she said. "I need to see the East Corridor." He looked at her with the expression of a man who has learned that when his employer uses a simple, reasonable-sounding explanation in that particular tone, the explanation is accurate, but not complete. He said nothing. She appreciated that. She took the service elevator, which she had not ridden in 11 years at this company. It smelled like machine oil and someone's old coffee and the faint rubber warmth of a place where practical work gets done. She rode it to the 36th floor and walked the utility corridor until she heard music something old and country and slightly off-key being hummed under someone's breath, and turned the corner to find Daniel on a stepladder, his arm inside a ceiling panel, fishing for something that was making a faint rattling noise in the ductwork. His lunch, a rectangular container of rice and vegetables, the kind you pack yourself the night before, because you know the cafeteria will be closed by the time your break comes around, sat on the shelf of his cart with a plastic fork balanced on the lid. He came down from the ladder when he saw her, and wiped his hands on his work pants. and looked at her with an expression that was polite and calm and completely without the nervousness most people showed her. "CEO visit to maintenance," he said. "That's a first." "I wanted to thank you properly," Elena said. "Not with a check." He considered this. All right, they talked for 20 minutes. It was the longest conversation Elena had with someone who wasn't discussing business or strategy in over a year. He told her Lily had gotten an A on her science project, a model of the solar system made from styrofoam balls and wooden skewers, the planets painted with her grandmother's old acrylic set. He told her Lily had called twice already that morning, once to ask if she could have a friend sleep over on Friday, and once to ask whether whales dreamed. He told her he didn't know the answer to the whale question and had spent his break reading about it because, he said, "You can't just tell an 8-year-old you don't know. She'll remember." Elena thought about that. She thought about being 8 and asking a question and being told, gently but definitively, that the grown-ups were busy. She thought about learning, slowly and then all at once, to stop asking. "Do you ever wish your life had gone differently?" she asked, not meaning to ask it, not entirely sure why she did. Daniel thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. Different how? "I had a good wife. I have a great kid. The job's honest." He looked at her steadily. "You asking because you think I should be somewhere else?" "No," Elena said, and she was surprised to find she meant it. She asked about the things she had read in his file carefully. Without revealing she had read it, feeling her way toward the question of the medical bills, the way you feel for a step in the dark. He told her about Lily's asthma with the matter-of-fact directness of a person who has lived with a difficult thing long enough that it has lost most of its power to terrify him, though not quite all. He told her about the ER visit 2 winters ago, the nebulizer treatments, the specialist in the children's hospital across town, who was very good and very expensive. He told her the insurance covered most of it, and the part that was left was manageable, and they were doing fine. He said this, the way people say things that are partly true, not as a lie, exactly, but as a rounding up toward the version of events they need to believe in order to get through the afternoon. Elena went back to her office and sat at her desk for a long time without doing anything at all. Then she called Marcus and asked him to pull the employee benefits package and the dependent's medical coverage provisions. He brought her the documents in 20 minutes. She read them in 15. She called the benefits director next, and after that she called legal, and by the end of the day she had initiated a review of the dependent healthcare coverage gap that affected, it turned out, not just one child in one file, but 63 families across the company's support staff. She did not tell Daniel. It was 3 weeks later when Lily was hospitalized again, not a catastrophic emergency, but serious enough for a night's admission, serious enough for the particular terror of watching a child struggle to breathe and knowing that the body you love most in the world is fighting something it shouldn't have to fight. Daniel got the call at 11 at night, in the middle of a shift, and he left immediately without completing his incident report, which was noted in the system and which he did not know Elena flagged herself, writing beside the entry, "Approved. Family emergency. No disciplinary action." Elena found out the next morning. She found out because she had, without quite acknowledging to herself that she was doing it, asked Marcus to keep her informally apprised of anything involving Daniel's file. She stood in her office and looked out the window at the city doing its relentless, indifferent thing, and she thought, "I can fix this. I can solve this problem. I can make a call and this child will be fine, and this man will not spend the next 6 months paying down a debt that he shouldn't have to carry." She made the call, anonymously, through the company's emergency assistance fund, which had a $27,000 balance that had not been drawn on in 4 years because nobody on the support staff knew it existed. She covered the remaining hospitalization costs. She was careful. She was thorough. She was, as she always was, excellent at logistics. Daniel found out on a Thursday. He appeared at her office door without an appointment, which was something that required getting past Marcus, which meant Daniel had simply waited in the reception area with the patient certainty of someone who understood that most obstacles are just delays and not impossibilities. He stood in the doorway with his hands in the pockets of his work pants and looked at her with an expression that was not quite anger, and not quite hurt, and not quite anything she had a word for. "You paid Lily's hospital bill," he said. "It wasn't a question." Elena set down her pen. "Yes. I asked you not to. You didn't ask me not to. You didn't know to ask me not to." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a technicality." "It is," she agreed. "I used it." He came into the room and sat down across from her desk. He didn't wait to be asked, which was also unusual, and he looked at her for a long time, with the particular thoughtfulness of a person deciding how honest to be. "When I was 23, he said, "my wife and I were living in a 2-room apartment in the east part of the city. There was a family upstairs that used to get food from the church pantry. Nice family. 3 kids, all in elementary school. The father worked at a loading dock. One day, someone from the neighborhood started a collection for them, trying to help. And the father found out. And he didn't speak to the person who organized it for 3 months. Not because he didn't need the help, because he couldn't stand the way people started looking at him after." He paused. Like he was a charity case. Like he was someone who could be solved. Elena listened. She did not interrupt. "I don't want to be solved," he said. "I want to be," he searched for it, "just a guy. A guy doing his job and raising his kid and getting by. Not a story, not a project." He looked at her. And his voice was careful, but not unkind. "When you pay someone's bills without asking, you're telling them their dignity is less important than your need to feel like you helped." Elena felt this land somewhere specific and interior, like a key finding the right lock. She opened her mouth and closed it again. She thought about her mother's hospital bills. She thought about the billing department calling at 7 in the morning. She thought about what it had felt like to be on the other end of a transaction you didn't choose, to have your worst moment quantified and settled by someone else's decision. She had hated it. She had hated it with a ferocity that had outlasted the grief and the medical debt both, and she had spent the next decade becoming the kind of person who never ended up on the receiving end of someone else's resolution. "I'm sorry," she said. She meant it in a way she hadn't meant a professional apology in a very long time. He nodded once. "The fund's a good idea, by the way," he said, standing. 63 families. That's real." He paused at the door. "Just ask next time." The board meeting 3 weeks later was the most contentious one Elena had presided over in 2 years. The story of the maintenance worker who had saved her life had moved through the media cycle quickly, as these things did, gathering sentiment and momentum before anyone had a chance to think carefully about what they actually wanted from it. 3 separate outlets had run the headline in nearly identical form. The communications team had drafted 3 separate PR strategies, each one more elaborate than the last. The board wanted to move on one. They wanted Daniel Brooks in a commercial, in a profile, in a campaign, the honest working man, the unexpected hero, the human face of a company that, as one of the senior board members put it with the practiced sincerity of a person who said sincere-sounding things for a living, has always believed in the dignity of every employee. There was talk of a speaking tour, a documentary short, a co-branded initiative with a national charitable organization whose name recognition tested very well in the company's key demographic. Daniel had, politely and without apparent resentment, declined every version of every offer. He did not want to be on television. He did not want to be in an advertisement. He did not want his picture on a building or his voice in a podcast, or his name attached to a scholarship fund that bore his name rather than benefiting the people it was ostensibly designed to help. He wanted, as he said to the second communications rep who visited him with a revised offer, to get back to the ductwork in the East Corridor, which was still making that rattling sound and was going to become an expensive problem if nobody addressed it soon. The board did not find this charming. "The man is sitting on an opportunity," said Richard Hale, the longest-serving board member, with the mildly irritated certainty of someone who had spent 40 years in boardrooms and had developed an imperfect understanding of human motivation. He could leverage this into something meaningful. "He's already done something meaningful," Elena said. The room was quiet. "He saved my life without hesitating, without calculating, without looking for anything in return, and then he went back to work." She looked around the table at the faces of people who had spent their careers in rooms like this one, measuring things, assigning values, converting human events into assets and liabilities. You want to put that on a billboard. He doesn't want to be on a billboard. I think, she said, that we should respect the difference. Richard Hale looked at her with the expression of a man revising an opinion. Since when do you think like that? Since recently, Elena said. She went home that night to her penthouse and poured a glass of water and stood at the window watching the city. And she thought not for the first time this month, not for the 5th or 10th time, but with increasing clarity and specificity about what she was actually building. What the numbers were for, what she had been running toward for 14 years, and whether, when she arrived, there would be anything there that resembled a life rather than a performance of having succeeded at one. The window was very clean. The view was very far. Down below, the street was full of people going home from things to other things, carrying groceries and umbrellas, and the ordinary weight of ordinary days. And she watched them and felt, for the first time in a long time, something that wasn't loneliness exactly but was adjacent to it, a recognition, an ache, a wanting to be down there in the current rather than up here observing it. She called her father that night. They talked for 40 minutes, which was 40 minutes longer than their usual calls, and he told her about his garden and his neighbor's dog and a book he was reading about the American Southwest, and she told him that she had almost died last month, and she was sorry she hadn't called sooner. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm glad you didn't die, Elle," and she laughed, actually laughed, the surprised, unguarded kind, and said, "Me too, Dad." It was an ordinary thing to say. It felt extraordinary to say it. One evening in the 4th week, Elena came down to the service floor not on any pretense but simply because she had decided to stop pretending that the pretenses were necessary. Daniel was eating his lunch, same container, rice and vegetables, the lid propped against a pipe, and reading something on his phone. He looked up without surprise, which she appreciated. She sat on a crate nearby. She had never sat on a crate in her office clothes. It was fine. "Tell me about her," Elena said. "Your wife." He looked at her for a moment to confirm she was asking sincerely, then set down his phone. "Her name had been Margaret," he said. Everyone called her Maggie. She had been a nurse, which was one of those coincidences that seemed less like a coincidence the more you thought about it. A woman who spent her days healing people, married to a man who had learned to perform the Heimlich maneuver because she had been worried enough about her own health to make sure someone at home could respond to an emergency. She had insisted he take the class. She had driven him there on a Saturday morning and waited in the car with a crossword puzzle and a thermos of coffee. And when he came out 2 hours later, she had asked him to demonstrate on her in the parking lot, which he had done, gently and with more embarrassment than she thought was warranted. While she laughed, he had thought about that afternoon so many times since she died that it had taken on the quality of a photograph fixed, lit from a particular angle, the details sharp and the edges soft. She had been funny in a quiet way, the kind of funny that didn't announce itself. She had loved old films and terrible puns and the specific chaos of Saturday morning cartoons with a 7-year-old who was already more intelligent than was entirely convenient. She had been sick for 8 months before the end. They had known, most of that time, that they were running out of it. And they had tried to spend it well. "She said something to me," Daniel said, "the last week. She said, 'Don't let Lily grow up thinking the world doesn't care, because it does. Most people care. They're just scared, or tired, or they've forgotten how to show it. Don't let her forget how to show it.'" He was quiet for a moment. "She was talking to me, but I think she was also talking about herself." Making sure it kept going. Elena had been looking at her hands. She looked up, and Daniel looked at her, and she felt her face do something it had not done in a very long time in front of another person. It lost its composure. Not dramatically, not in the way of someone falling apart, but in the small, quiet way of a wall that has been holding too much for too long, and is allowing itself, very carefully, to let some of it through. She didn't make a sound, but her eyes filled, and she didn't look away. "I'm sorry," she said. "Thank you," he said, not dismissively, the real answer. "I've been very afraid," she said, and it came out simpler than she expected, stripped of the corporate vocabulary she usually wrapped around everything uncomfortable. "For a long time, of needing things." She paused of asking, and not being answered. I thought if I just kept accumulating resources, position, capability, I would eventually become safe enough that I wouldn't have to be afraid anymore. She looked at him. It doesn't work. No, he said. It doesn't. He picked up his fork. But knowing that helps a little. Knowing it doesn't work means you can stop doing the thing and try something else instead. What else? He considered. Ask the 8-year-old. She's got better answers than both of us. Elena laughed. It surprised her. She initiated the changes gradually, because wholesale institutional transformation done quickly was usually wholesale institutional transformation done badly, and because she had learned was still learning that the most lasting things grow from the middle, not from the top. The dependent healthcare coverage gap was the first thing she'd already started the review, and by the 3rd month it was closed, 71 families newly covered, the communications going out as a policy update rather than an announcement, because she had thought about what Daniel said about dignity and had decided the right move was to make the help invisible. You do not make a ceremony of fixing something that should never have been broken. Next came the Emergency Family Assistance Fund, formalized and publicized internally, with a clear application process that anyone in the company could navigate without requiring them to explain their circumstances to their immediate supervisor or justify their need to someone with authority over their livelihood. Then the First Aid Training Initiative CPR and Heimlich certification for every member of the building staff, then extended to all employees who wanted it, then integrated into the standard onboarding for new hires. 312 people trained in the first 6 months. She thought about that, sometimes 312 people who could do what Daniel had done. Who could be the person standing 30 feet away and moving without hesitation? The number felt like something real. It felt like multiplication. She spent more time walking the building. Not inspecting, just moving through it. Unhurried. Without a destination attached to the movement. She stopped at the service desk and learned the names of the evening crew. She ate lunch. Actually ate it, in the first-floor cafeteria twice a week. At a table by the window. Usually alone, but sometimes not. Sometimes with a security guard named Raymond, who had worked the overnight shift for 9 years and knew more about the building's moods than anyone in the executive suite. The staff noticed these changes. They didn't say much about it directly. That was not the dynamic she had spent years building, but she caught the shift in the way people looked at her when she passed through common spaces. Less careful, less guarded, more like the way people look at someone they have tentatively decided to trust. It was a new feeling. She found she wanted more of it. And that the wanting itself felt new, clean, and uncomplicated in the way that honest appetite is always cleaner than the hunger you've been denying. Daniel noticed none of this publicly, and all of it privately. He mentioned, once, that the break room on the 36th floor had a new coffee machine. And he said it with the mild, genuine pleasure of someone whose day had been made incrementally better, and he left it at that. He did not connect it to Elena. He did not need to. He was not keeping score. Lily came to the office for the first time in November, on a Friday when school let out early, and Daniel couldn't arrange other coverage. And Elena had said, without being asked, that she was welcome in the building for the afternoon, that there was a conference room with good light and a whiteboard that wasn't being used. Lily arrived in her school uniform with a backpack twice as large as she needed and a set of colored markers and the specific, alert energy of a child who finds everything mildly interesting and some things fascinating. She walked through the lobby looking up at the ceiling and at the screens and at the people, cataloging it all with the systematic attention of a person who takes the world seriously and has not yet learned to pretend otherwise. She shook Marcus's hand when he introduced himself, which he reported to Elena afterward with an expression of unguarded delight. She asked him what his job was and whether he liked it, and whether the coffee machine in the reception area was for everyone or just for important people, and Marcus told her it was for everyone, which was true, and she nodded as though filing this information under a useful heading. She did her homework in 45 minutes, and then drew an elaborate diagram of what appeared to be the water cycle, labeled in enthusiastic but not entirely accurate terms. And when Elena stopped by to look at it, Lily explained each element with the authority of someone who has made it her business to understand things and does not see the need to be modest about having done so. You work here? Lily asked. I run the company, Elena said. Lily considered this. My dad fixes things here. He does. He's very good at it. He's good at most things, Lily said, with the absolute conviction of someone for whom this is not a boast but a simple fact. He made me a solar system for my science project. It was pretty accurate. She paused. The rings on Saturn were a little big, but that's okay. Elena smiled. Did you get a good grade? A minus, Lily said. Miss Patterson said Saturn's rings are made of ice particles, not solid material. And my rings were solid. But Dad says if you're going to be wrong, be confidently wrong, and then learn from it. She looked at Elena. Do you have kids? No, Elena said. Do you want them? The question landed with the innocent precision that only children and the very old manage, hitting the unmarked targets that everyone else has learned to route around. Elena looked at this 8-year-old, who was waiting for an answer with the patient, unjudging attention of someone who asks a question, because she actually wants to know, not because she wants to demonstrate that she thought of it. I think, Elena said carefully, I haven't figured out yet how to make enough room for someone else. Lily nodded, processing this. Dad says that too. He says you have to make the room first before you need it. Because if you wait until you need it, it's too late. She uncapped a blue marker. He made room for me before I was born. He fixed up a whole bedroom. She paused. He painted it the wrong color. But he fixed that too. Elena stood there for a moment, longer than necessary. Then she said, Your dad is a pretty smart guy. I know, said Lily, and went back to her water cycle. The company held its annual internal recognition ceremony in December. It was usually a bland, careful event, a catered dinner, some plaques, a few anecdotes from the executive team about the values of the organization. Elena had attended every year and given a speech from prepared remarks, and shaken hands in the right sequence, and left as soon as was professionally appropriate. This year she had added a new category. She called it the Humanity Award. She did not explain the name in the program. She thought people would understand. When the moment came, she did not produce a check. She did not produce a plaque. She walked to the podium and said, Several months ago, I needed help. And a person in this building didn't hesitate for a single second. He didn't calculate what it might be worth to help me. He didn't wonder whether it was his job to help me. He just helped. She paused. I have thought about that for months. I have thought about what it means to act without transaction, to give something without attaching terms to it. I thought I understood how the world worked. I was largely wrong. She looked out at the room, 240 people, executives and support staff and maintenance crew, and administrative assistants and security guards, all in the same room at the same round tables, which was also new this year. Daniel asked me not to make a big deal of this. So I'm going to honor that by making only a medium-sized deal of it. The room laughed. Daniel, in the third row, put his hand over his eyes. She gave him the award, which was a small engraved thing that he accepted with the dignified discomfort of a person who would genuinely prefer to be somewhere else but is making the best of where he is. When the microphone was in front of him, he looked at it for a moment, then looked up at the room, and said, without notes, without preparation, the most important thing I learned from that day was that I had learned it from someone else. My wife taught me that the world needs people who don't stop to calculate. My daughter reminds me of it every morning. He paused. If anything I did meant something to anyone in this room, then just do it for someone. That's the whole speech. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when something true has been said in them. Elena was seated in the front row. She looked down the row at the guests who had been brought in by staff members, and she found Lily 3 seats away, in a dress that had been pressed very carefully, and shoes that had been polished, sitting with the particular uprightness of a child on her very best behavior, at an occasion she understands is important. Lily was watching her father. Her expression was not complex. It was simply pride, clean and total and unambiguous, the kind of pride that has no performance in it, that exists whether or not anyone is looking. After the dinner, in the lobby, Elena found Lily waiting while Daniel helped a colleague with a coat that had gotten caught in a chair. She crouched down to Lily's level, which was something she did not often do, physically adjust herself for another person's perspective. "Did you know," she said, "that your dad changing how I think about things has changed how a lot of people in this building are doing their jobs?" Lily looked at her with serious, considering eyes. "Like how?" "Like being more careful about what matters. Being less in a hurry, thinking about people, not just numbers." She paused. "Your dad taught me that." Lily tilted her head. "Dad says the best teachers don't know they're teaching. He's right about that." Lily smiled, the sudden, unguarded smile of a child who has just confirmed something she already suspected. "He says people need kindness more than money," she said. "I think that's true, but I also think people need both." Elena looked at this 8-year-old for a long moment. "You're going to be formidable," she said. "I know," said Lily simply, and went to find her father. Daniel appeared at Elena's side, carrying Lily's enormous backpack over one shoulder, with the practiced ease of someone who has done this 10,000 times. He looked at Elena, and she looked at him. And the lobby of Meridian Tower moved around them in its usual, urgent, indifferent way, badges beeping, elevators opening, shoes on marble, and they stood for a moment outside all of it, in the small, still space that sometimes opens up between people who have shown each other something real. "Thank you," Elena said. "For everything." He shook his head slightly. "You did the things. I just said some stuff in a hallway. You said the right stuff." He smiled. It was a small, real smile. The kind that doesn't know it's being observed. Lily materialized at his side and took his hand without looking up from something she was working out in her head. Daniel said goodnight to Elena and said something quietly to Lily, something that made her nod with the seriousness of a person who has just received useful information, and they moved toward the lobby doors, the man in his good coat and the girl in her careful dress and her enormous backpack, moving through the bright lobby and out into the winter evening. And Elena watched them go. She stood there for a moment after the doors had closed. She was not sure what she felt, exactly. It was not a simple feeling. It was the feeling of someone who has been living in a house with all the curtains drawn and has recently started, one window at a time, to let the light in, not because the light is painless, because it is not, because light falls on everything, including the things you would rather not see, but because a room without it is not really a room at all. It is just an interior. It is just a person, alone with her own silhouette. She had almost died in this building. A stranger had saved her. She had tried to pay him, and he had refused. And she had spent months being quietly, stubbornly rearranged by that refusal, by the understanding that there were still people in the world who acted without accounting for what they would receive in return, not because they were naive about how the world worked, but because they had decided, clearly and deliberately, that they would not let the world work that way on them, that they would be a different kind of evidence, that they would demonstrate, in the small and ordinary currency of daily action, that the transaction was not the whole story, that something in the human experience persisted beyond the ledger. Daniel was not a saint. He was not a symbol. He was a man who packed his own lunch and knew the answer to the whale question, and painted his daughter's bedroom the wrong color and fixed it afterward, and who had looked at $100,000 and found it lighter than the weight of what he would have had to give up to take it. That was all. That was everything. The lobby doors opened for a couple coming in from the cold. A gust of December air moved through the lobby, sharp and clean and carrying the faint smell of the city's particular winter exhaust and pretzel carts, and the cold metallic clarity of a night that is almost freezing and hasn't quite gotten there yet. The marble was very bright under the overhead lights. Somewhere on the other side of those doors were two people walking into an evening that held ordinary things: dinner to make, homework to finish, a solar system with slightly oversized Saturn rings waiting on a bookshelf, a bedtime story about whales or planets or whatever 8-year-olds dream about when the world is being good to them. And Elena Carter, who had built a career on measuring the value of everything, stood in the lobby of the building she ran and found that she could not measure this, and that the inability to measure it was not, as she had always assumed, a weakness. It was, in fact, the whole point. In a world where everything carries a price tag, where every interaction is weighted and calculated and cataloged according to what it might yield in that world. The rarest thing is not a person who has more than everyone else. The rarest thing is a person who has decided that some things are simply not for sale. Not because they don't need the money, not because they haven't looked at the number and felt its gravity, but because they have looked at something else, a child's face, a late wife's voice, the simple fact of another human being in trouble, and found it heavier, found it more permanent, found it more worth protecting. Daniel Brooks had gone back to work after saving Elena Carter's life, and the world had continued around him, busy and transactional and largely indifferent. And he had continued inside it, the same way he always had, with a packed lunch and an honest shift and a phone call home to ask whether whales dreamed. He had not changed. He had simply, by being exactly what he was, changed something in the person who was watching. And that, in the end, is how the rarest things happen. Not through transformation, through witness.